Morning, colleagues, and welcome to the third webinar for the Lesotho GCF Readiness Training course. Today we're going to be focusing on the National Designated Authority, which is a key GCF strategic partner. You have been through the module online, and I'm aware that the assignment is still outstanding and that should go up live today, but any questions on that also welcome. The NDA, just as a reminder, is the Lesotho Meteorological Authority that sits within the Ministry for Water and Energy. This is LMS was a selection that was made, an appointment and selection that was made by the Lesotho government about a year ago, maybe a bit longer. And part of the GCF readiness support, a critical part of it is to provide support to capacitating the NDA, but also, which is an ongoing process, but also with that, to make it clear to all the stakeholders, to Green Climate Fund work in Lesotho as to what the NDA is meant to do. So this webinar today is more broadly focused around those kinds of issues. Hilary, if we can go to the next slide. Do you want to give me the laptop and I'll change the slides? Sure. Thanks. Sorry, colleagues, we just needed to sort the continuity out here. Just give us 1 minute.
You should be able to see you and well while I'm struggling on the projector.
My apologies, colleagues. We've just got a small connectivity problem. I'm not sure if you can see me. Dr. Moiti, can you see us?
Yes, I can see you.
Okay, so the problem's on our side, and I will just share the screen again, the PowerPoint.
It should still be shared as far as I know, so select that one. There we go. Here we go.
Oh, that was the one I was trying to, okay, that's fine, I'll carry on. Dr. Moiti, can you see the presentation?
Yes, it's all right.
Okay, great.
Okay.
All right, then I will continue. I'm not sure why our slide is not working, but that's not your problem. So what we'll go through today, and you've been through this already in the module, is an overview of what the NDA as GCF strategic partner means. The strategic role of the NDA in the GCF project cycle. We'll talk about how to choose the appropriate partners, which will differ and usually differs on a case-by-case or project-by-project basis. Remember, though, that we are working with you on developing the country program. And so the country program will be done in partnership with many, many stakeholders. And then from that point onwards, once you've got the country program in place, you will then work, or the NDA rather, will work with different partners for different projects. So we'll go through that. And then we'll talk a little bit about the financing arrangements with the GCF, which will include the private sector, a little bit about private sector engagement, but primarily we'll talk about the instruments that the GCF uses in financing Green Climate Fund projects. And I'm assuming there may be some questions from your side on this. But please do take a note of your questions, because we'll, as we always do, end with a question and answer session. For some reason, I can't. Oh, okay, that's fine. I'm there. All right. So in terms of the learning objectives, we've got 4 learning objectives in this module, which I've kind of been through already. Firstly is so that you really understand, hopefully by the end of the module, including the coursework that you've done, the assignment, and this webinar, which I hope will also help you with your assignment, is to really understand what the NDA's strategic role is, and what this institutional setup for engagement has to be, to comply with GCF requirements, but also to align with best practice in terms of stakeholder engagement processes, which brings us to the second strategic learning objective, which is about developing the no objection procedure for Lesotho. Colleagues, this is a key output of our work with Lesotho stakeholders during the course of this year, the remainder of this year.
You can carry on.
We accept that it keeps going, which is the no objection procedure. And this has to be in place, including a process for how the NDA will engage with stakeholders in Lesotho to reach a point of no objection on a particular project proposal that the NDA wishes to submit. And this is something I've said before in our webinars, is that the no objection procedure is not just a question of sitting down and writing a letter and signing it and sending it off to the GCF. The GCF wants to see that due diligence type process has been undertaken to get to that point of being able to write a letter and sign it and send it to the GCF. So there needs to have been a stakeholder engagement process and consultation process on whether or not this is a priority proposal, but also the structure of well, not the structure so much as the content, the objectives of a given proposal. So these two things go together, the learning objectives 1 and 2, they go very strongly together. And therefore it's important for you to understand both how the no objection procedure works, give input to that as we proceed with this project. And to be able to do that, you really do need to understand the NDA's strategic role and the institutional makeup for engagement. So those two objectives go very strongly together. They also feed into the third learning objective, which is about selecting the right partners for GCF country programming and for project implementation. And a fourth learning objective, are the financing arrangements and financing instruments that the GCF use, and the issues that they sometimes have with those is something I'm also going to go through with you, because there are sticking points that can sometimes arise. So let's start with the NDA as the GCF strategic partner. What does this mean, colleagues, is a key aspect. So we thought just to start by outlining the roles and the responsibilities of the NDA. Simply put, the NDA serves as the national liaison institution with the GCF. So it is the primary point of contact between the Green Climate Fund and Lesotho stakeholders. So in other words, or put another way, the NDA is the conduit for all correspondence, communications, decision, conveyance, etc., between Lesotho government and stakeholders and the GCF. And then within the NDA, a focal person is also appointed, and that person is the person that receives most of the correspondence and manages the communications. Within that overall responsibility, the NDA has 4 key tasks that it's responsible for. The first is strategic oversight for alignment with national priorities. And this, colleagues, is where the country program is pretty central, right? Your country program will set out the strategic agenda for climate finance in Lesotho, what your key project pipeline priorities are. Once that document's in place, you can revise it every few years with the GCF, but that becomes the agenda. And what the NDA is responsible for within that is both enabling the development of the GCF country program, which is another key output of our work with the NDA and stakeholders in Lesotho under the readiness program this year. So that's another thing that will be forthcoming from us, and you are working towards the country program in your assignments already in the training modules. But what the NDA will be responsible for once that country program is in place is making sure that project proposals that are developed and then submitted to the GCF are well in line with those stated national priorities as agreed with stakeholders in developing the country program. So that holding of the strategic vision and priorities is a key NDA role. A second role that goes with this, both in terms of developing the country program, but also in terms of working on specific proposals after that, is to convene national stakeholders. So those of you that were in the January workshop, you heard Dr. Moiti asking us when we're coming to Lesotho again. We were there at the end of January, and that was a workshop that was convened for this GCF readiness program by the NDA. And that is a continuous process of engagement that the NDA is responsible for. And so it therefore needs to keep itself up to date with who the key national stakeholders are, including external partners, which we'll come back to later in this module, and to know when to convene them at the appropriate points, entry points of developing both the country program, which is what we're busy with now, and is due to be submitted to the GCF at the end of this year, and then subsequently in terms of developing proposals. Typically, just to talk briefly about proposals, because it's not hugely on our radar for the work with you, the GCF would normally like to see that sort of broader stakeholder workshops are convened approximately twice in the life cycle of developing a project proposal and before that proposal is first submitted to the GCF. It's part of a no objection procedure, which is why I'm mentioning it now. And it's something that it's one of the things that we'll be documenting in developing the country no objection procedure with Lesotho. And then stakeholders are also convened through a proposal development process by going perhaps into a field. So let's say, for example, hypothetical example, that you are developing a project in 3 priority catchment areas in Lesotho, a climate change project. Those catchments would need to be visited in the process of developing the proposal, and stakeholders within those catchments and pertaining to those catchments would need to be convened. So the convening process is a significant process, and it's very important that the NDA understands when to do that and with whom, some of which we'll come back to later today. The NDA is also responsible for approval of climate finance readiness support. Colleagues, you've got this in progress at the moment. So the Climate Finance Readiness Project is what we are working with Lesotho on at the moment. So that approval has already been obtained. And then the NDA is responsible for issuing no objection letters, which I've spoken about, for projects and programs through the national no objection procedure that is under development at the moment. If we can go to the next slide. The required capacities of the NDA that are associated to that are knowledge and capacity building. So the NDA must be able to do capacity building and have the knowledge of national priorities, strategies, and plans. It's got to play a coordination and consultation role, which I've talked about. And that means a strong role and leadership role in country coordination mechanisms and multi-stakeholder engagement. So if, for example, and we've spoken about this before, the Integrated Catchment Management Unit, which is a recently established multi-stakeholder platform for integrated catchment management purposes, if, for example, that unit is proposed for use in multi-stakeholder coordination, and approval processes, the NDA would need to work very closely with the ICMU in getting to that point. I'm mentioning it as an example because integrated catchment management is emerging as a very strong priority for Lesotho, including in the climate change space, but not limited to it. And I'm mentioning it particularly because the ICMU seems to us from various work we've been doing in Lesotho, not only this project, to be a widely representative platform, and usually best practice, and you will all understand this completely, is to not duplicate or overburden the system with multiple platforms. So that's also important. So it's something to think about, is really why I'm raising it, as Lesotho continues on its journey of accessing green climate finance. So you want to be as efficient as you possibly can. The third capacity area is oversight to ensure alignment with country priorities, as discussed in the previous slide. And this requires the NDA to play a very strong role and be capacitated to continuously ensure that alignment is secure between the project proposals that are submitted to the GCF and all GCF activities with the country program, which sets the strategic agenda. Alignment also needs to be ensured by the NDA with GCF policies. The GCF has a number of cross-cutting policies. You'll learn more about these in the last module of this training course, which will be in a couple of weeks' time. And these policies include an Indigenous Peoples policy, an environmental and social safeguards policy, and a gender mainstreaming policy. Those cross-cutting policies have to be adhered to in every single proposal, as well as in your country program. And this is a role in terms of oversight that the NDA plays throughout the process of engaging with the GCF. And then the fourth area, colleagues, is a big area. It's awareness and communication, which really means that the NDA needs to be highly familiar with mitigation and adaptation strategies and policies, proposals in Lesotho, the current status at any given point in time of mitigation and adaptation activities, bearing in mind that the GCF is not the only funder of your climate finance needs. So the NDA has to keep an eye on multiple balls that are often in the air. And I know from other experiences that this is very hard to do because people don't always communicate with each other, as we all know. So being able to be aware of everything that's going on in the project, in the country on climate finance at a given point in time is very important. And I'll come back to why it's important in a minute. But what I want to first say is that, colleagues, you really need to support your NDA in this regard. They're not magicians, and they need to be on the receiving end of as much information as possible. What the GCF, and just to come to why this is so important, and I'm going to use a live example that we're dealing with in Tanzania at the moment. I know I keep using Tanzania in my examples, but it is very current for us, and there's a lot of really important lessons that are coming out of that engagement. But there in the Tanzania situation, the GCF is querying conflict, or overlap rather, is probably a better word. They're querying the overlap between the project proposal that we've been working on with the government of Tanzania and the NDA there, and other proposals that the GCF are aware of, but the NDA was not aware of in Tanzania. So it's obviously embarrassing for the NDA to sit in a situation where they're not familiar with another project proposal that's obviously quite far advanced in Tanzania, and somehow they have to be on top of this. So having an eye on overall climate change activities in the country is critical, and it requires a very strong working relationship with the custodians of the climate change policy, as well as with different departments that have got different relationships with different funders who go ahead and do their own thing. So that's going to be an absolutely critical function. And one of the things we need to think about as we go through the remainder of this year with you is how we are going to make sure that the NDA is empowered and in a position to have an understanding of what's going on. It also needs to be able to raise awareness and communicate with key stakeholders. I mentioned this earlier, and all the appropriate in-country institutions and stakeholders. And again, of course, the challenges that I've mentioned in terms of knowing what's going on is also always knowing who is doing what. And these are the key institutions and stakeholders. We'll talk a little bit about this more again a bit later in terms of choosing the right partners. But as you've probably already learned from, or should have already learned from your course, is that the accredited entities that can operate in a country like Lesotho in terms of accessing the GCF funding, there are many of them. And many of them are already international cooperating partners to the government of Lesotho in various forms and through various relationships and various programs and initiatives. And keeping a handle on all of that is also difficult. So again, this requires collaborative governance between the different stakeholders in Lesotho. And I really am encouraging you as best as I can to work with your NDA in terms of capacitating them so that they can represent you adequately in turn. To move on to the mandate and structure of the NDA, so how is it meant to do all of this? As you can probably have figured out already from what we've discussed and from the course that you've done, the NDA is required to be multidisciplinary. But remember that you're dealing here with meteorological services, Lesotho's Meteorological Services Unit, who've got a very particular discipline. And it was an interesting choice because meteorological data is obviously critical for the climate rationale, for example, in your country program, but particularly in your proposals. And the GCF are very, very sticky about the climate rationale, and they're very strong in terms of wanting to see national meteorological data in that climate rationale. So from that perspective, having LMS as your NDA is ideal, right? They've got the best possible access in the country to meteorological data that you need for your climate rationale, but they don't necessarily have a whole lot of the other disciplines. So they may not be experts, for example, on integrated catchment management or on climate smart agriculture processes. And so therefore, and those are just examples, they might not be renewable energy experts, but they do need to understand the overarching climate change agenda and environment, and they need to understand how climate finance works and comes together. Your NDA staff in Lesotho are extremely competent. We've been working with them since the beginning of this project. You've got a very good team there, so we have all confidence in them, but they cannot possibly have all of the expertise that is required for a particular project proposal development. And so the partnerships are absolutely central. And again, that collaborative governance that I've talked about a lot already, and I will talk about a lot more today, is pivotal to your success in accessing the GCF. So it's a partnership approach. Your NDA is your representative, but they're not everything. And colleagues, if you don't work with them, they can't do everything for you. So that's an important understanding and insight to have, is that everyone needs to work together if you want success in accessing the GCF. The functional expertise that the NDA is required to have includes climate finance governance, which we're also at One World required to build the NDA's capacity on, and that's a work in progress at the moment. And as I said, we are learning more and more how competent that team is. Another level, very important level of functional expertise includes the integration of climate change issues as well as national policy on climate change into project proposals, and it will start with the country program. Stakeholder engagement and management, monitoring and evaluation is absolutely central. Coordinating the management arrangements of a particular proposal. These are all among the cross-cutting aspects that the NDA needs to hold the vision for and hold the capacity overall for in Lesotho. In the last module, we went through the Green Climate Fund investment criteria, and I'm going to repeat what they are. Remember, there are 6. So there are country ownership, impact, efficiency and effectiveness, paradigm shift, and now my mind's gone blank on the last one, and sustainability. So those are the 6 fairly cross-cutting and also fairly integrated investment criteria that the GCF's mandate is derived from. So remember, they can't fund something that does not align with those criteria because their board won't let them. So it's not that the GCF as an institution is being difficult in that regard. That is an international mandate. And remember, this is a multinational fund, the GCF, which is funded from all over the world. Why am I mentioning this now? I'm mentioning it because this is another aspect that the NDA has functional expertise that it needs to have, and that's to make sure that every proposal, at least from the NDA's perspective, aligns with each of those 6 investment criteria. And the reason for that, colleagues, to take that story one step further, is that the NDA should not be getting a no objection letter together from stakeholders in Lesotho if it is not confident that the proposal does align with the GCF mandate. Because remember that the NDA is the conduit between the GCF and Lesotho. So it's got a huge responsibility there. And I mean, one thing you can be certain of in this world of uncertainty is that the GCF will come back and ask multiple questions in at least 5 or 6 rounds of reviewing a GCF proposal. So it's not necessarily that the proposal will be perfect, but it can never be that the NDA submits a proposal that doesn't align in its mind with those 6 investment criteria. That's not an option. So that climate finance governance and investment criteria alignment is absolutely critical area of expertise of the NDA. A third aspect of the mandate and structure of the NDA is this question of collaboration for consensus and specific expertise. So as we've said before today and in your course module, the NDA plays that role of coordinating different stakeholders across different sectors, and it's got to decide which stakeholders and which sectors are appropriate at a given, in a given situation. And obviously, given what I was saying earlier about the NDA can't be everything for everybody, it needs to make sure that it works with stakeholders that complements itself. So to go back to my earlier example, the NDA or Lesotho, through the NDA, is busy developing a renewable energy project proposal to the GCF, and the NDA are not energy experts. It is within the ministry that's got that, but that it works with appropriate stakeholders in that regard, for example. There are many other examples. And remember that a proposal must meet at least one of the 8 GCF results areas, but it can meet 2 or 3 of the GCF results areas. So it could align with renewable energy and with agriculture, for example. So it could also cut across mitigation and adaptation as well as between different sectors. That means that it would need to work with the appropriate stakeholders in that regard. And then lastly, colleagues, the NDA is mandated to work with nationally agreed mechanisms that can be established to strengthen the NDA. So everything doesn't have to rest within the NDA, and different countries have done different things in this regard. So in Mozambique, for example, I was there middle of last year, in fact, probably this time last year, working on GCF developments there. The Mozambican NDA and they're very undercapacitated. They've got far fewer people actually dedicated to the NDA in that unit than LMS has got in Lesotho. So they've established an advisory group, and that advisory group meets once a quarter. and it reviews where the government and country of Mozambique are vis-a-vis the country program and what proposals are currently in the pipeline. It reviews the strategic objectives, etc. And so that platform has been put in place by the NDA and communicated to the GCF. So the GCF knows this in a formal fashion. They've put in place a mechanism that can help them to meet their mandate as the NDA. And this opportunity is obviously also available to the NDA in Lesotho. And it is something we're currently looking at with the NDA in terms of making sure that a no objection procedure in Lesotho is robust and that it will empower the NDA rather than work in conflict with the NDA and be enabled by supportive mechanisms. So the point that I'm trying to make is that we are looking at what supportive mechanisms are needed. In terms of the NDA's convening role, I've spoken quite a bit about partnerships. It is responsible for selecting the right partners for developing and implementing the country program. And it will then also be responsible for making sure that the right partners are in place for each of the priority project proposals that you identify in the country program for future development. And so the cycle here is one that I think everyone here will understand clearly. Stakeholder engagement underpins anything in development usually, but it does mean mapping and identifying potentially relevant stakeholders. So that's a stakeholder mapping exercise, conducting stakeholder analysis to identify stakeholder capacity. So it's one thing to identify, oh, I need renewable energy, people that are responsible for renewable energy in the country. I need people that are responsible for agriculture or water or whatever it is. It's another thing to understand what their capacities are for developing a particular proposal. And this is also very important because at some point in a proposal development process, in the same way that happened with this GCF readiness program that One World has been appointed to support, decisions have to be made by the NDA and others as to when to appoint external support and when you can just manage with what you have internally in Lesotho. And this is a constant decision-making process. And for that reason, among others, it's very important that the NDA understands the capacities of the stakeholders. Are the capacities there, for example, to develop a very detailed economic and financial appraisal model for a given proposal? And I'm picking on that example with intent because typically countries don't have that kind of capacity within their government partners, and they need to go and find it externally. And that's one example, but it's a good one because it's not expertise I would normally expect to find in a government institution. And if the expertise is there in the government institution, they pretty much don't have the actual time and human resources to carry out such modeling. So that identifying stakeholder capacity is critical. Identifying stakeholder interests are important. So who's going to have a vested interest in a particular project and proposal? Who's going to have a vested interest in making sure that the country program goes ahead? Who's going to have a vested interest in making sure some of these activities don't go ahead? So that's the political economy type analysis that we've talked about before, that the NDA would need to bring into identifying or conducting stakeholder analysis. And then there's the third element, which is usually a continuous process. In other words, it doesn't start and stop, is to engage with stakeholders, at which point the NDA needs to decide who to engage, how to engage them, what role different stakeholders are going to play, and who are the most critical stakeholders to a given proposal or process. And so the level of stakeholder engagement, the format of that stakeholder engagement, the who, the what, and the how are all fairly critical roles that the NDA plays. Next slide. I am changing the product. So in terms of guiding the engagement, there are 7 principles identified that the NDA has at its disposal to guide engagement processes in Lesotho. So one is that the process is inclusive. And colleagues, I do not mean, and nor does the GCF, we do not mean that inclusive means engaging with absolutely everybody on absolutely everything. I've spoken about this already, but not all stakeholders are relevant to every single process. Plus, the process needs to be realistic. The GCF, this is, one of my personal gripes with the GCF is they want wide and deep stakeholder engagement for all the proposals, but it's a very expensive process. And it's time consuming. So, sometimes the GCF needs to be pushed back on. And one of the best ways of doing that is to make sure that you can show inclusion to the GCF. And for them, inclusion means gender mainstreaming, Indigenous peoples mainstreaming, that the most vulnerable stakeholder groups have been consulted, and this project will benefit the most vulnerable stakeholder groups, and that those most vulnerable stakeholder groups agree that this is the biggest priority for them. Not somebody coming and telling them it's the biggest priority for them, but they actually identify this particular project or intervention as their biggest priority. So those are the key insights you need to please take home with you today. And if you've got any questions on this, please do ask in the Q&A session. But I just wanted to give you a little bit more nuance as to what inclusive means. And as I said earlier, the GCF has got policies that guide all of this. So they have, as I said earlier, Indigenous peoples policy and a gender mainstreaming policy, for example. They also, however, expect to see that those policies do not supersede any policies you might have in Lesotho in that regard. In other words, that there's dovetailing between nationally relevant policies for inclusion. But that's how they guide inclusion. And then what they want to see when you submit a proposal is evidence of having engaged with. So simple things like submitting a participant list for a workshop would need to show gender disaggregation, for example, and a youth disaggregation. So how many youth were involved? Were these the most vulnerable people, and was gender balance achieved in those stakeholder engagements? So your stakeholder engagement report and your participants schedule are among the proof that you would submit to the GCF that this has been addressed, inclusion, and they interrogate it. And they also reserve the right to go and visit a country, and they don't use the word audit, but I'm going to, because it's the easiest way to understand what I'm trying to say, but they can go and speak to your stakeholders if they want to and really go and interrogate whether or not what's been written down on paper actually happened. So there's a fair amount of scrutiny that the GCF is allowed in terms of how it operates and its operational procedures and its approval processes. So the second principle is highly related, and it's why I spent so much time on the first one, is collaboration and consensus. And that principle must underpin the no objection procedure that is developed with Lesotho. Engagement needs to be transparent. I've already touched on this, objective, and it must be predicated on accessible communication materials. So if, for example, you've got language issues and you're developing a project in a very rural, remote part of Lesotho and English is not the most widely spoken language, then you will want to make materials about the project and the concept you're trying to engage stakeholders on available in their local language, or through graphics or visuals or videos. So this is what we mean by accessible communication. And those tools that you develop in developing your proposal and engaging with stakeholders, you can also submit to the GCF as part of your proposal. So for example, with your stakeholder engagement report, to show this is how we communicated with stakeholders and things were made very accessible to them. A fourth principle is strengthening partnerships and relationships. I've spoken about this before. It's a key objective of any engagement process is to keep on building trust, to keep on building relationships towards climate change implementation processes. But particular colleagues, what you don't want is a situation where you prepare your proposal, you submit it to the GCF in 2023, the project finally gets implemented maybe in 2028 or 29, because 5 years is pretty standard in terms of turnaround time. Either your stakeholders were not thoroughly engaged or they're not all there anymore, and the new bunch or those that have forgotten or other priorities have come up in the meantime. People go, actually, we're not so interested in this project anymore. And now you've got approval for it. So you don't want that. You have to find ways of keeping your stakeholders with you, and that's about strengthening relationships and partnerships in the field. Those relationships also need to be empowering for partnerships, and the interactions need to be empowering so that people can actually take ownership of their own agenda and project interventions. And for all of this, you need regular and timely consultations, particularly regular, and this is one of the biggest challenges because of the costs that I spoke of earlier. And because of that, you do want to build on existing platforms and mechanisms. That's absolutely critical. So colleagues, that's an overview of the 7 principles. As you will recall, and I mentioned it again earlier, one of the 6 GCF investment criteria is country ownership. And as I've also pointed out today, country ownership is something that the NDA needs to hold and manage within its GCF engagement process. And this is an ongoing and an evolving process. Your policies evolve, priorities can change, and political will often shifts. You know, you might have different ward councillors that come in at a district level, for example, or a catchment level. You might have new politicians at a national level, and what often comes with that on new political agendas. And part of demonstrating country ownership is that there's political ownership as well of a particular program or project. So the NDA always has to keep an eye on what's happening in the policy environment and the political environment. And that does necessitate that relationships continue to be built in a continuous manner that's inclusive and participatory. And that starts with this readiness program, and it continues with the development of the country program, which also builds country ownership. So this country program is an important tool for you in terms of engaging with the GCF, for the NDA in terms of engaging with the GCF, because it can always go, why are you arguing about this proposal? It's in our country program. All the stakeholders agreed that it was a national priority. So, you know, again, this is why you want to work with your NDA to make sure that those tools are at their disposal to support you. And the country ownership therefore needs to continue throughout the country programming and the segment and the project cycle as you develop the project proposals. This requires effective engagement of and ownership by relevant national as well as subnational stakeholders. And of course, the composition of those stakeholders changes according to a given situation. And there are opportunities to ensure country ownership along the way. So, for example, as I mentioned earlier, in the development of a country proposal, a project proposal to the GCF after your country program's been established, there are opportunities to conduct strategic consultations on the development of that. You will have further opportunities to engage with us, and we will be heading to Lesotho in the coming weeks to further the development of the country program and also to further the development of the national no objection procedure. So there are plenty of opportunities to ensure country ownership along the way. And after I've had a sip of tea, I will start going through the no objection procedure. So colleagues, I can't emphasize enough, I think, as to how important the no objection procedure is. It's put differently, it's a key decision process. As I've indicated already, this is led and facilitated by the NDA, but it does involve multiple stakeholders. And I will come back to that in a minute, who those stakeholders will be. It considers all the expertise and interests that are available or are of issue or concern or opportunity in the country. It needs to consider where co-funding will come from, and it needs to show compliance with national priorities. So there's a lot embedded, colleagues, in the no objection procedure. And this is why I keep saying the same thing, and that is, this is not just a question of sitting down and writing a letter to say we don't object to this project. There has to be evidence that there is no cause for objection, and it's not just people putting up their hand and saying, I object or I don't object. It's a question of then also showing alignment with policies, showing that you can raise co-financing. That's an important GCF requirement they don't like. And they're not mandated to fund a proposal 100% on their own. They are mandated to fund a proposal where co-funding has been secured. And so the co-funding becomes part of the no objection procedure. And then the compliance with national priorities, yes, we will highlight these and document them in the country program, and there will be supporting evidence to show that, and those are the appropriate national priorities. Then when you develop a proposal against a given priority, you will further need to demonstrate that national priorities have been complied with. So in that sense, the no objection procedure I think needs to become your friend, to put it simply, in the future. It's an important tool for you. It helps you to ensure country ownership. It helps you also to realize ambition. But to do that, you have to take stakeholders along with you. I think what's important is to not become too complicated about it. So it's important that you strike a balance between full participation and not being overly complex about it in the no objection procedure. And please remember that, because it's very easy for stakeholders to go, oh, I wasn't consulted, and to moan. It's not always constructive unless there's a real legitimate reason. That was a renewable energy project. I'm the renewable energy policy expert in the country. I wasn't involved. That's legitimate. But for a stakeholder to go, oh, I wasn't involved in the development of this agriculture project, even though I'm an energy expert, that's probably not legitimate. So, this keeps coming back to the point that I keep making, that this is a collaborative process, colleagues, and you need to be working together, not against each other. I'm not raising these as issues because I'm perceiving that stakeholders in Lesotho are not working together. From what we can see, you are. I'm talking about this based on experience from elsewhere and knowing what can happen. So I'm more talking about what could happen as opposed to what is happening. But I think, we all want to access the GCF, and therefore we want to make this as smooth as possible, while also making sure that inclusion and collaboration is intact. So the no objection letter, this letter that I keep talking about, that the NDA must submit with the country program as well as with each project proposal, it affirms compliance with the country program and of a proposal, and between the country priorities and the country program as well as the proposal. It also ensures or affirms that there's compliance with the laws and regulations in the country, and that no regulations are being contradicted in the way that the proposal is being developed. And it also affirms that the country program and the proposal align with the GCF policies. So the NDAs, when it signs that letter, it's taking on board a big responsibility in terms of confirming all of these issues. Then with this, colleagues, the NDA has got 3 key tasks in developing a no objection procedure. Its first task is to identify the criteria or the factors that form the basis of the no objection procedure. So that's the what. What underpins this no objection procedure. Then it talks about, or the NDA is responsible for identifying who needs to be involved in the no objection procedure, and so must identify the right stakeholders and work where possible with existing platforms and groups, and decide at the beginning of the process, this is who we're going to work with, and make sure that that then covers all the key stakeholders that need to be consulted at a given point in time. And then it needs to develop a sequence of activities and actions to check against the criteria. That what I think is a typo, it should be how. So that really is how you are going to comply with the different criteria, or have complied with the different criteria that were identified at the beginning of the no objection process. This is how you are going to comply with those. The GCF has got minimum requirements for the no objection procedure, and they've got a guideline. The GCF likes to issue guidelines rather than rules, but do know that they exercise those guidelines as if they were rules. So this is an important thing to note. So they're trying to give flexibility in their guidelines, which is why they don't issue rules. They're trying to give flexibility for a country like Lesotho to integrate its own rules and procedures. But in the end, the GCF needs compliance with its own guidelines. So its minimum requirements are threefold. One is that you show consistency with your national climate strategies and plans. One of the issues we've got in South Africa, for example, is that, and I was writing about this on the weekend, so it's quite fresh in my mind, but stakeholders are criticizing the South African government for contradicting its own policies. So a particular example is that the government's got quite a few climate change policies in place. We've got a National Climate Change Bill or Act that is going through Parliament as we speak. And these policies and the bill and the low emissions development strategy, all of these policies come together to say that we have embarked and are serious about a low carbon future, and we've got targets for net zero carbon by 2030 and 2050, depending on which institution you're in. But at the same time, we're building we're opening new coal mines, and we are building new coal-fired power stations. And stakeholders are criticizing this. And this is the kind of thing that we are talking about in terms of the consistency, because that criticism gets to the ears of the international community, and then they go, sorry, we're not funding Eskom's renewable energy strategy, because actually they're not serious about it. Bearing in mind that Eskom is a state-owned entity. Yeah, so that's, I'm giving you an example that's on your borders or consumes you in Lesotho, but I'm giving it from outside of Lesotho because I don't really want to comment too much in my independent role here on the state of policy in Lesotho, but it's going to be very important that the no objection procedure is clear about this. And if there are inconsistencies, because sometimes this does happen, what I've just described in South Africa, it does happen, to show how you are addressing it will be important. The second minimum requirement is conformity with national relevant laws and regulations. And colleagues, this is one of the annexures that are compulsory. Every time you submit a proposal, you have to submit an annex that shows an in-depth review of the project proposal against the laws and regulations in the country. And the third requirement is that your program or proposal is country driven. And that you'll demonstrate through having the right stakeholders, through your policies and how the program aligns with those policies, and with your climate rationale. So these are the key climate issues in Lesotho. Colleagues, we're now going to move on to the strategic role of NDAs in the GCF project cycle. And I'm getting mindful of time because we're already on the hour. So the strategic role of the NDA, and I touched on this briefly earlier, is to make sure that country priorities are aligned with the project proposal pipeline development. So the proposals that are in your pipeline as they get evolved, that they align with the country priorities, and those country priorities will be clearly articulated in the country program. And then with this, the NDA needs to ensure that the project ideas align with the country program, and that the GCF will have sight of through if you submit concept notes for your proposals to the GCF, which we would recommend. It's not always required, but it's preferred, and it's preferred for you because it's useful to get an early reaction from the GCF as to what they think about your project, plus it gets it on their radar formally. And then particularly through the proposal development, the submission, and what we haven't got here, which we should have actually, my oversight, is a last point, which is around, or last 2 points actually. So Hilary, can we make a note to add this in for future reference? I would also say that the project idea needs to continue to align with country priorities through reiterations of the proposal, because as I said earlier, the GCF comes back and they come back often. As in iteratively, we're on round number 4 in Tanzania with the proposal we developed for IUCN there with the government of Tanzania. The GCF have come back for the 4th time with comments. And so, it's a few years down the line since this was all started. The first concept note was produced and submitted to the GCF in 2018. So it's 4 years ago, and the project hasn't been approved yet. So obviously, there could have been changes in terms of country priorities, so you still need to show that alignment. Another aspect I would add here is M&E. As you're monitoring and reporting on your projects, that you're still able to show alignment, and you'll do that anyway through how you develop your results framework. I've just finished a midterm review of a river basin strategic action plan that affects Lesotho. It's a RASACOM, which is the Orange Senqu River Basin. And Lesotho is one of the member states. And one of the things that I observed in my report is that the results framework that was originally developed for that strategic action plan is not relevant in every single country anymore. And Lesotho was one of the countries that it was not as relevant in now as it was when it was first developed. So that relevance needs to be, a continuous discussion. And I think this would be something useful for us to build into our work with you. Colleagues, I said we would talk about this issue of working with the right partners. And perhaps before I go to the actual slide, one of the reasons that I think this is such an important thing to consider, and I've touched on it already, is a country like Lesotho, which is, a least developed country, so it's got high levels of poverty and low levels of development. Therefore, Lesotho attracts a lot of development partners, and you have a wide range of development partners operating in your country, and many of those development partners, as I said earlier, are also accredited entities to the GCF. So they can access GCF funding on behalf of the government of Lesotho. How it normally works is it's not often that the NDA goes along to an IUCN or a GIZ or a UNDP and says, please, will you help us develop a proposal? Often it's the other way around. So often those partners who've also got their own KPIs and objectives to meet, and performance indicators to meet, they'll often be the ones that, UNDP might come and knock on the NDA's door and say, oh, we've got this project idea, we'd like to develop it with you, and the NDA goes, yes. And then the next day, UNEP comes and knocks on the door, and then the following month, GIZ comes and knocks on the door, and before you know it, the NDA is sitting with multiple partners that are not necessarily aligned with the country processes. So being mindful and intentional about working with the right partners is absolutely critical. And it's about setting your own agenda and not having your partners set your agenda for you. So important to think about who your potential partners are, and this can happen in a stakeholder mapping exercise, and then what their roles are. And those partners can come from the international cooperating partners, they can come from civil society, they can come from the private sector, academia, different donors, different funds, but they play different roles. So the accredited entities we've spoken about, and typically those accredited entities will come from international institutions, especially in Lesotho, where you don't have direct accredited entities at the moment. And they can come including from Southern Africa, so from the region, which, for example, is the DBSA, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, under whom we are doing this readiness work. So they're an accredited entity. They're also a readiness delivery partner, and they've employed one role to be that readiness delivery partner. Then you can have a whole range of executing entities. And those can be different government departments. They could be a civil society organization. They could be a private sector institution. And in a given project proposal, you probably will have at least 3 or 4 different executing entities for implementing that project. And then you can have technical advisors, and you've got your co-financiers. Often your co-financiers and your executing entities and your accredited entities is where that co-financing can come from, but it can also come from elsewhere, like your National Development Bank, who are not necessarily an executing entity, but they could be a technical advisor. So there's a mix and match that can go on here in terms of different roles and responsibilities. But what you really want to always have in mind is, why are you selecting this particular partner? What are they going to be doing? Do we want them because we want their money? Do we also want them because we want their money and we want them to implement because they're capable and competent and they will meet the GCF implementation evaluation criteria? Do we want them because they've got particular expertise? So, you know, they might be really strong on climate smart agriculture in catchment areas, for example. And what are the different, as I said earlier, there's a matchmaking that goes on here and a mix and match. You know, what are the priorities that we have as Lesotho in developing this particular proposal for its implementation, and therefore, who do we need on board with us? So one of your key partners is your accredited entity. And that accredited, each project proposal will need to have an accredited entity at its help. Remember that the accredited entity is the organization that receives the money from the GCF, and then it disperses the money on behalf of the GCF for the project implementation. So its role is to oversee, supervise, manage, and monitor the GCF approved country projects and programs. And for Lesotho, please remember that I've said this already probably at least 3 times, is that you have a number of international cooperating partners with whom you already have relationships that are also accredited entities. So I know UNDP operates in Lesotho, they're an accredited entity. GIZ operates, they're an accredited entity. So you know them often as bilateral funders or support partners, but they can also be your bilateral partner in implementing a GCF project. So the table at the bottom just shows you specific GCF considerations for AE selection that you need to think about. So one is the GCF needs to know that the accredited entity can actually manage the size of budget that you're looking at for a particular proposal. And colleagues, this is important because to get accredited, an entity has to be able to show the GCF how much money it can manage. And so the GCF has a look at its financial statements, what kind of revenues and incomes the institution has managed in the past, what kinds of capacities it's got for implementing the funding. And some accredited entities are only accredited for the GCF small grants window. So for example, in South Africa, we've got 2 accredited entities here that are national and regional. The one is the DBSA, which, as you know, is supporting this program. The other is the South African National Biodiversity Institute. They're only accredited rather, to implement projects of $10 million and under. So they're all automatically out the picture if you've got a project of $30 million. You can't go to Zambia. Well, we can't, they're not accredited to you, but so in South Africa, we can't. So the size of the project's important. The risk category of the project in terms of its environmental and social and governance aspects is critical, and this guidance is given in the GCF policy. The track record of the accredited entity in a given project proposal theme. So IUCN, for example, the International Union for Conservation and Nature, they're known for landscape type projects and landscape resilience building type projects. And so they're an obvious choice if that's something that you're trying to do in Lesotho. So you need to be able to look at your potential accredited entity in terms of what kind of track record and experience it has in the field of or in the sectors of your particular project and its approach. And then the GCF is particularly interested in the functions, the judiciary functions of the accredited entity. So how strong is the ability to project manage, to manage funds, to be able to facilitate on lending and blending of finance and disbursements of funds in a timeous manner. Other considerations you want to think about are is the alignment of your partners with your country priorities, which could, for Lesotho is probably very, very skewed towards adaptation, but in other words, the appropriate balance between adaptation and mitigation in your priorities, to also balance between a wider coverage versus a narrower sector process, to think about timelines, can this entity deliver within your timelines? And does the project fall within the timeline of a given policy that it aligns with? The alignment between the proposed GCF project and the accredited entity mandate, colleagues, this is another point I just want to emphasize. And DBSA has had difficulties with this. And so they're a good, it's a good example because they're your accredited entity as well. But they've had difficulties with this in South Africa because the DBSA, like any institution has got a particular mandate and has to operate within that mandate because it's accountable to its governance structures, whatever those may be. So the DBSA has got a board, for example, that it's accountable to. And so what you have to make sure is that the accredited entity's mandate aligns with I suppose the mandate is okay, a word to use of a particular project proposal. So if the project proposal is to do landscape restoration, for example, and you want the DBSA, or you think you want the DBSA to be your accredited entity for that, what you have to go and do is have a discussion with the DBSA to see if it aligns with their mandate. Because if it doesn't align with their mandate, they're going to get flack from their accountability mechanisms, and you are going to end up with a project lead that doesn't have expertise in your particular project area. So this is a very, very important consideration. And so with that, you would also want to matchmake between your project pipeline and the capacity and expertise of the different AEs. When we come and do the prioritization exercise with you in Lesotho, we will work with you in that workshop to try and identify the different accredited entities that are at least possible for the different project proposals so that you've got a picture in your head as to who these partners can be. So we'll do some facilitative matchmaking with you. And then colleagues, and I do want to finish quite soon because I want to give enough time for questions and answers. I'm going to go briefly through the financing arrangements. We didn't go into this in a huge amount of detail in the course notes, because I prefer to focus on the sort of higher level issues, and you will learn as you go through the development of your project proposals around the detail. But colleagues, first and foremost, the GCF gives money in different forms, right? So it gives grants, it can give loans, it can give concessional funding, and that concessional funding is absolutely critical because that is what is needed to make a project viable. So if it does give you, if the GCF does give you a loan as opposed to a grant, or maybe it's a mixed blended finance of a grant and a loan, the loan finance can be concessional in that the GCF are not expecting a high rate of return. In other words, they won't be expecting a high interest rate and a high rate of return on the investment. And you can then pass that concession on to whoever you are funding through the proposal. So let's say, for example, you set up a microfinance facility in Lesotho for smallholder farmers to access funding to enable their climate smart agriculture endeavors. That microfinance facility could be enabled through concessional finance because the concession that you can pass on to the people that borrow the money from you is that they maybe have a 6-month no payback period. In other words, they don't have to start paying the loan for 6 months. And you can give them a highly reduced interest rate to what they would get in the market. So if they were going to go to a local bank and they had to pay the loan back at 10%, you might give them a 2% loan because the finance is concessional. And this is what makes that microfinance, in that example, the microfinance facility viable for the smallholder agriculture player who doesn't want to have high financing costs every month because he can't afford it or she can't afford it. So it's viable for them. It's viable for the bank that's on lending the microfinance money because you've guaranteed the loan or the microfinance facility through the GCF money, so the bank doesn't have to take that risk on. And it also has to demonstrate fairly low risk for the GCF, low risk in terms of their mandate. In other words, this microfinance facility will have high impact and returns because climate change is being addressed. Smallholder farmer incomes are not being reduced because of climate change impacts. Those are the kinds of things that GCF want to see. So as you can hear in that example, across the sort of implementation chain of that concessional money, you know, from when it leaves the GCF to when it gets to the AE, to when it goes to an executing entity, to when it actually gets to the development bank or the finance institution that's then creating that microfinance facility, to when it actually gets to the smallholder farmer and then circles back again, back through repayments, is quite a process. And there are different requirements and different viability questions along that cycle that I've just drawn in the air for you. So that concessional funding is really important. I'm emphasizing it because probably one of the most important things you take home with you from this course is that you don't need to be experts on finance, but you need to understand how concessional finance works and how to justify it to the GCF because they interrogate this. They're very nervous, particularly of their money being duplicated and for it not being fully accounted for. They're very nervous of that. Secondly, the GCF works through intermediaries, as we've already explained, so your accredited entities who may then blend the GCF finance. So they might get a whole chunk of money from the GCF, they might then contribute their own resources, and in doing so, they can increase the level of concessionality. And then thirdly, colleagues, only revenue generating activities that are feasible and sustainable will be supported by the GCF. So if they think, to go back to my microfinance and smallholder farmer example, if they for any reason think that the smallholder will not be able to pay that money back, they will not approve that part of the project. And we're busy going through this exact interrogation issue with the GCF in Tanzania. And then colleagues, lastly, in terms of the role of the private sector, We haven't emphasized this enormously in the course for Lesotho, because although we do believe you will get into, over time, strong partnerships with the private sector, they're not your biggest priority at the moment. But there are two categories of private sector partners that the NDA can work with. So these can be companies. So for example, you've got quite big textile companies in Lesotho. So it could be them. And then financial sector institutions. And in terms of financial institutions, that can be both private, as in commercial banks, or development finance institutions like DBSA. Then let's just talk briefly about why the NDA should engage with the private sector. Firstly, the private sector is a key player in the economy. And secondly, private sector should be a stronger partner in transformation and climate action. So it follows, right? If you've got private sector players that are key actors in economic development, and economic development has to be climate smart and climate resilient, then it follows that those private sector players that are key in the economy must be your partners in transformation and climate action. Otherwise, you're not going to have that transformation. The textile example that I gave earlier is important. Years back on the project I was talking about earlier in Orassa, in the Orange Senqu Basin, one of the biggest issues in Lesotho was pollution, and still is. Actually, I was there about 2 months ago in this regard. Biggest issue is pollution of the water. At the time of designing the program, one of the biggest pollutants in Lesotho was the textile industry. And so they were encouraged and incentivized to build wastewater treatment plants. And I went to see some of them, and it's happened. So now the biggest source of pollution isn't that, it's from elsewhere. And so other things need to be addressed, but they were a private sector player. The textile industry, they still are. Agriculture, every smallholder farmer in Lesotho just about falls within the private sector, right? Privately owned household or farm, or operated household or farm, that is contributing to the climate change problem and can make a big contribution to climate change action. And that last example, the smallholder farmers, are probably your biggest private sector partner in Lesotho going forward for climate action. So colleagues, that was a marathon. I'm going to stop there, and the floor is open for questions and answers, and I'm just going to take the presentation off so that I can see. Colleagues, please raise your hands and unmute your mic when you want to speak. And Hilary, if you can help me monitor, that would be great. I'll also have a look and see if there's anything going on in the chat room. Is there anything in the chat? No, but there's a hand up. Yeah, Monsieur Letuma, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. My question is on the no objection process. Under the no objection process, you indicated that one of the decisions is with regards to co-finance contribution. Can I check, is this a requirement to have maybe an institution that is proposing or developing a proposal, or to have the co-finance part, or the government to have co-finance into that report, that proposal for submission? Thank you. And right. If yes, what percentage?
Good question. Yeah, no, that's fine, no problem. I think I'll just answer each question as it comes up. I did see another hand. Thanks for that question. The government is an important co-financier. And in Tanzania, for example, the project proposal is for $60 million, and co-financing is coming from various partners, including government, of 30 million. So I'm also trying to answer your second question, which I'll come back to. And that 30 million co-financing is coming mainly from government And in that instance, from the Ministry for Agriculture, because agriculture is the backbone sector of that particular project proposal. But there's also co-financing coming from research institutions who are interested in the landscape issues, and from the Tanzania Agriculture Development Bank, who is interested in lending money to farmers. So it was my example, in the form of loans for climate smart agriculture. So as you can hear, Monsieur, the co-financing there is 50%. And while it's not a hard and fast rule of the GCF, their preference is for 50% co-finance. And that co-financing, you didn't ask this question, but I'll answer it anyway. That co-financing doesn't always have to be in hard cash. It can also come in the form of in-kind contributions. So I talked about a research institution in in Tanzania, for example. They are providing seedlings for restoring landscapes, and they're providing expertise in supporting local communities to plant those seedlings. So they're not actually giving money, although the money is being transferred through both the seedlings and the capacities. So yeah, I hope that helps you there. But please do come back if I haven't been clear enough. Hilary, I was sure I saw another hand.
Was another hand. There's a question in
Did
the
it
chat.
disappear? Oh, okay. All right. So the chat room says, what factors does the NDA need to consider for it to decide whether a certain project qualifies for a concessional loan or a grant? That's a very broad question. So I can only, I suppose, answer it through an example. So I'll go back to my Tanzania example and the example of microfinance or loans for smallholder farmers. So in the Tanzania project, we've asked for some of the money to be allocated to the setting up of a finance facility, which the Tanzania Development Bank, Agriculture Development Bank, will implement. So they'll manage that facility. What the GCF money will be used for is to enable the TADB, the bank, to on-lend to farmers at low risk. So low risk to the farmer because it's low interest rates and delayed payback periods, and low risk to the TADB because the GCF money underwrites or guarantees. In other words, if, and this is important to answer your question in the chat, if the if the TADB runs into a situation where many of the smallholder farmers that it lends to default and don't pay back the money, that the risk is mitigated for the TADB because the GCF money will be then used and not paid back to the GCF because it's used in the form of a guarantee. So the risk is reduced both for the bank and for the farmers through the GCF money, and that's the concessionality aspect. What the GCF is considering in that example is they're very concerned about two things. One is, what are the criteria that the TADB, that's the Tanzania Agriculture Development Bank, will be using in deciding who it's going to lend money to and for what? And are those criteria robust, and will they do enough due diligence so that that risk is mitigated? And secondly, they're concerned that the TADB is doing this anyway, right? So that they're already lending to farmers because that's what they told us. So we put it in the proposal, and now the GCF wants to know how they're going to account for the GCF money that's used for this facility versus their own money that they'd already committed. That's the duplication issue I was talking about earlier. And so we, at the minute, we're busy trying to get the proof and the criteria out of the TADB, and they haven't thought about this. So they're battling to give it to us, the information. We're not going to get that proposal approved without it, and I can't make it up for them. So it's something we encouraged them to think about 3 years ago, and they kept saying they're doing it, but they didn't. We were remiss in that we didn't check properly. And we will pass this lesson on to all of you, is that when your partners say they're doing something, you need to hold them accountable, that they're actually doing it, because they're busy letting that proposal down at the moment. And I wrote to them yesterday to say exactly those words. So I feel fine about saying it in this meeting. because I've already said it to them. I hope that was clear. Lebohang? Is it Lebohang? Yes. No.
The hand up
Is Mupanyani.
Yes.
Sorry, Mupanyani, please will you go ahead?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm still on the co-financing. I want to make clear if I understand it's something like cost sharing, and in some proposals you
Mupanyani,
are told some of the fine percentage. So is there a specific percentage for the cost sharing or co-financing? Is there a specific percentage that if this proposal is so much, then 5% should be from the co-financer or cost sharing?
Yeah, Mpunyani, it's not, as I was saying earlier, it's not a hard and
Thank
fast
you.
rule. Okay. Yeah, it's not a hard and fast rule. The GCF prefers a 50-50 situation. So they'd like 50% of so let's say your project is worth $40,000 and you need $40,000 to implement it. The GCF would prefer, it's not a rule, but they would prefer to see that 20 million of that 40 million comes from various contributing entities in Lesotho. And that can also be your accredited entity. So the guideline is 50% co-financing, but it's not a hard and fast rule. If you can't come up with 50% co-financing, and you say can come up with 30% from a range of different partners. So in Tanzania, we've got, I think, 7 different co-financing partners. And that's what's made up the $30 million there for the 60 million. Some of it is in kind, as I said earlier. If we had not been able to come up with 50%, we could have tried to justify that to the GCF. And just to say, you know, this project is a huge priority. This is why it's a massive priority. The co-financing is not available to the extent that we would like, but there is the following type co-finance available. The only rule that I can make really explicit, Bunyani, in answer to your question, is that the GCF is unlikely to fund something that's got no co-financing. So there must be some co-financing. And normally you should be able to fund in-kind contributions in various ways. So always important to think laterally about your co-financing. I hope that is of help. Are there any other hands? And anything else in the chat?
Last call for questions. Not that I can see.
All right, well, colleagues, I don't see any more questions. You know about the help desk facility if you need that. George, we are going to be putting the assignment online. So it's sitting on my desk at the moment, colleagues. I'm the person you can shout at, but we will get it online today. And then that will be followed shortly by the final module. But if you've got any other questions from today's module, please do feel free to email and we'll give you the answers as best we can. And we look forward to seeing as many of you in Lesotho as possible in the near future. Thanks very much for your attention today.